In this video, we will answer 5 common questions we get in our classroom from enterprise architecture organizations. We are asked, what framework should we choose? We are just starting out with EA. What's the first thing we do? There's so much to do. We are asked, well, we just got a baseline at this point. Where do we go from there? We are also asked, we got a target architecture. How do we make sure the solution architecture aligns to that? We will answer these common questions in this video. All frameworks have strengths and weaknesses. As you see from this slide, originally from Microsoft, that Zachman, TOGAF, FIA, and Gartner, all of them has pros and cons. Zachman has great taxonomy completeness. TOGAF has great process completeness. So none of them are perfect. We got to pick one and then supplement with the best of the rest. So what framework should I choose? None of these are perfect, as we just saw. So an organization has to decide which one they're going to start with. So select your primary framework and then add to that processes, techniques, views from other frameworks and technologies. Many organizations adopt TOGAF as the foundation framework, since it provides a process framework, and then add to that the best practices, such as FIAF's taxonomy is perfect. And you can add to that the comprehensive checklist of the stakeholders and views from Zachman. So pick one, add to it the best practices from the rest. As you can see from this diagram, EA can be overwhelming, as you have already experienced probably. This is from TOGAF version 9.1. The level, the breadth, the timeline it takes 5 to 10 years can be overwhelming to start with. So EA is overwhelming, but if you look at this diagram, FIAF helps. In FIAF, we basically have concept of segment architecture, the scope of which is line of business. This is a great place to start, because here you can take a line of business, create the do as is and the to be state, and you can do that for the 4 domains of architecture. And you can look out for 5 to 10 years. And this will be a great way to start. Then each architecture analysis cycle can focus on a segment. The question comes, the third question in the series, is what to do with the baseline. Again, FIA reference models are quite good in this sense. You can start with the BRM or TRM here. Think of them as drawers when you are trying to organize your information. So what we try to do here using this model is classify your architecture assets. For example, the baseline items in this slide shows application servers. This organization has 6 of these. For each item, classify the item using the lifecycle classification scheme. And then you can finalize and publish these classifications. This way you can create an enterprise architecture building block. And sometimes you may find that in one of these drawers you actually have nothing, and that could be a problem. You may have to come back and address that. So by going through this, you have created an architecture building block, and you have established a portion of your target architecture. How to ensure the alignment between target architecture and solution architecture? The way to go about it is through requirements, because requirements are well understood by the stakeholders. So your target architecture, if it's asked by the stakeholders that your application has to run on different devices such as iPad and browser, the way to translate that is easy. You can at that point translate that to solution architecture, as it could be HTML5 is the answer at that point. So if we start with the requirements, it's very easy to have a traceability from the target architecture to the solution architecture. If you want to come up with requirement sets, it's very easy to find this in many different sources. A good example is NIST. It's a great resource to start from. Here is a sample NIST requirement. This can be bundled into requirement sets. And that way you can make an architecture of building blocks for topics such as identification, authentication, access control, and audit logging. The last question that comes in this top 5 is governance with little standards or target architecture. We just started out. How do we go about it? Realize that governance is more about communication and collaboration. So even though you don't have standard or target defined, when you're reviewing a proposal, you can point out that you can identify stakeholders that warrant in the analysis. You can point out to them there are gaps in business processes and the requirements that have to be considered. You can point out that impacts to existing business processes and systems that weren't considered before. At a minimum, everyone would know more. As you go forward, standards and review checklists can be developed incrementally. Do that by looking at good proposals and then incorporate their format or content into the enterprise templates. Also learn from the bad ones. Add the things they're missing in the checklist. Other governance lessons that we learned are partner with initiatives. Give them a draft template, let them try it out and see how it goes and learn from that. If you cannot get in front of a project, which is possible given the workload, realize that you can learn from them. If something worked, use that to create a reusable building block. Never cancel a meeting. You can continue the momentum. There's a lot to do. Even if you don't have a proposal to review or approve, you can spend the time to classify existing technologies. You can create architecture building blocks. You can also develop charters, processes, procedures, educational materials. You can also use this time to educate the board members on architecture best practices or emerging practices and technologies. So in this video, we have summarized the answer to the 5 common questions we get. So the question asked is, what framework do we go with? And the answer is, start with one and then supplement with best practices from the others. The question asked is, EA is so overwhelming. Where do we start? The answer is, start with segment architectures. We are asked, we got a baseline. What do we do with it? The answer is, create building blocks. We are asked, how do we align target architecture with the solution architecture? The answer is, use requirements. And we also asked, we are starting with governance. We do not even have a target architecture. The answer is, start with communication and collaboration. Hope you found it useful.